Hello people of YouTube, my name is Mishka Valhalla, and today we are going to talk about the Dwarves, or the Dvergr. And the Dvergr are of course those that dwell in Nidvellir, which is of course in the underworld. Nidvellir is home to many dwarves, many of which inspired the names of some of the dwarves in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Just as much as pretty much everything in his series was inspired by Norse mythology. But of course his own personal twist and everything. The foremost of the dwarves, or at least one of them, is Durin, and that is of course one of the dwarves mentioned in the Lord of the Rings, but of course is based on an older dwarf, one of the original dwarves. I think he was the second dwarf to be born, Durin. And the first dwarf to be born was Modsognir, which means he who drinks might. So Modsognir is the first and foremost of the dwarves and the ruler of all the dwarves, so the king of Nidvellir. And it's interesting how Nidhogg, and being in the underworld, I know Nid, being an insult in a way, but still Nidvellir still being related to his name, Nidhogg, both being in the underworld and both being related. I'm going to get more into the relationship between the dragons and the dwarves. I know this comes probably to a surprise to some people. I know maybe some have heard of the dragon Fafnir, which we will go into him and his siblings. The dragon Fafnir was of course a dwarf, and he had a brother named Otr and Regan, and he and his brothers of course knew Sigurd, who was later the dragon slayer, because he had to slay Fafnir. But we will get into that story in a little bit. So Nidvellir, home to the dwarves, those who forged the weapons of the gods. They are an ancient race that was said to be formed from the maggots of Ymir. So when Ymir's body was formed to create Midgard, they were born essentially from the earth itself, the maggots. And it's said that they essentially gained, humanoid appearance, that of the gods, and human intelligence, just like the humans. And so essentially they are, underdwellers, much like the Dokulfar or Svartalfar, which are the Dark Elves. All these beings living in very close proximity. But then of course I will mention the fact that the further back you go in Germanic mythology, Norse mythology, or should I say Norse spirituality, when we're looking at archaeology, the closer to the earth, the spirituality gets. So essentially many of these realities could have originally all existed essentially in Mother Earth herself, in the underworld. And that's why there is such a strong connection to the earth when it comes to the dwarves, and it comes to their origins and their significance and connection to the dragons, which of course are an expression of the earth itself, the very earth's core itself, sort of the energy that comes from the earth and essentially in a way protects the earth and shares its energy and its power with those that live on the earth in Midgard. So there are many stories of the dwarves, 4 dwarves that of course married and laid with Freya so that she could have her necklace forged. Brasingamen, the hammer Mjolnir, was of course forged by the dwarves, Brokar being one of them. And then of course Loki turning into a fly, distracting the dwarves, and essentially causing Mjolnir to be flawed. So originally Mjolnir was supposed to be a 2-handed weapon, but then it turned into a 1-handed weapon because Loki was buzzing around distracting the dwarves while they were forging his hammer. And the dwarves of course also forged Gungnir, Odin's spear, and the very shaft of the spear was carved out by a branch of Yggdrasil, so the tree of life. And then of course magical runes were inscribed on the spear, and then of course given to Odin. And then of course Golan-Bristi, the golden boar, was forged essentially. A boar was forged for the god Freyr, being the god of prosperity, the lord of the elves, very heavily connected to fertility and the earth. Again, further going back in Norse tradition, you notice that the amount of focus on the earth itself increases, and the amount of goddess cults increase, because there was a feminine connection to the earth, seen by the ancient peoples. It was believed that especially vulvas in the Norse and Germanic traditions had a connection to the earth, being not only being, of course, of great feminine origin, but they have essentially extra gifts and abilities that allow them to leak into the different realities of Yggdrasil, which is the tree of life. Essentially, the dwarves are heavily focused on the stones, like the stones around me. I believe that the dwarves live in the stones, essentially they look for gold, they mine, they forge weapons, like I said, magical items. They are probably very smart in the runes because Regan, very knowledgeable in the runes because Regan, the runes was one of the many things that he taught Sigurd while Sigurd was growing up. Sigurd knew the dwarves. He of course knew a certain dwarf king, and that dwarf king was named Hreidmar, and Hreidmar was the father of Fafnir, Alter, and Regan, and they essentially brought up Sigurd, but the Aesir gave the dwarves essentially a magical ring. First they gave it to their father, and essentially corrupted him. So his sons ended up killing him, and so Fafnir ends up protecting their gold and the ring itself. Well, you see these parallels with like Lord of the Rings, the one ring, and so long story short, all the dwarves ended up dying because in that family ended up dying because Fafnir ended up turning into a dragon and protecting the gold, and Sigurd killed Regan because Regan told Sigurd to kill his brothers, for the ring, because he wanted the ring for himself, and so Sigurd had to end up kill Regan in the end, so he ended up killing everybody, or everybody ended up being dead in the end. So that left Sigurd cooking the heart of Fafnir, and when he tasted the blood of Fafnir, he could understand the speech of birds. That happened earlier on, of course, in the original story. I'm terrible at telling things in proper order sometimes, but so essentially it was the birds that Sigurd could understand after drinking the blood of Fafnir the dragon. He learned that Regan was plotting against him, was plotting against Sigurd, so Sigurd ended up killing all of them in the end. So long story short, they're all dead. But it was through essentially the Aesir giving them a cursed ring, because the treasure that the ring came from essentially was cursed overall. And so that's of course the common theme: the dragons and the dwarves protecting their gold and their treasure, and it's because they are strong symbols of wealth, and in ancient times they could have very well been actual people, maybe not even short, but like focused on the earth, and over time, they died and would become part of the earth, through their mounds, and then they would become, of course, interdimensional dwarves, or whatever you would call underground dwarves in Nidvelir. I also have a theory that the dwarves could have very well had connections with the Neanderthals, previous human inhabitants in our world. And of course, other humans start to discriminate against them, maybe even interbreed with them. So essentially, they ended up dying out because we now have hybrids, of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, as you could call it. Essentially, the idea is that all these gods, all these beings, could very well be connected to our ancestral lineage.